Welcome back, session 2, or session 1.2. Going to mix it up a little bit. We'll jump in, eh? I want you to start by just imagining, and some of you can look at this beautiful picture instead. Just imagine a lovely string quartet playing on a stage. In our view is obviously two beautiful violins, a viola, and a cello. The images trigger the wonderful warm colours of the instruments, the exquisite curves that those instruments have that we know all too well. They're pieces of musical technology that, in many respects, haven't changed for centuries now. Your eye might be drawn directly to the bow that seems to dance over the strings of the instruments. They seem to cause the instrument to come alive and deliver different and interesting timbres, sometimes very sweet song-like vocal qualities, sometimes very raspy, angry bee type noises. Now, the bow is a really interesting instrument in itself, and it might look so familiar to you that you don't notice anything unusual about it. They say that it didn't enter into Western history until somewhere around the 5th century. And it did so not as a musical instrument, but as a weapon of the same name, the bow. Usually attributed to the Asian nomadic horse riding people known as the Huns. It's of course very hard to kind of archaeologically find evidence to whether, when we find a bow, because of its simple elements, wood and horse here, whether we are finding an actual weapon or we're finding an instrument. It's quite different from, say, an arrowhead. And because of those quite simple elements, the wood and the hair being quite perishable, yes, it's very hard to discern what they are. And we don't see any pictures of them in the pictures or sculptures or frescoes of early Greek or Roman civilization until about the 4th or 5th century. Interesting, isn't it? So we're staring at this quartet, and you might then glance that they are all reading these bits of paper in front of them, aren't they? With these lovely little dots and lines and slashes all over them. And you might notice that on them they have these 5 parallel lines on them, which that hasn't always been the case. They started off way in the early century and around plainsong, to be honest, as 4 lines, and just as dots, not having tails, and not necessarily representing pitch as exactly as we see them here. This form of notation is really attributed to the 11th century schools of European music. Monasticism, again, being one of the great things, places where Western music was born, and they really gave and contributed something significant to Western music. This is a picture of some plain chant music. You can see the four lines of the stave and the different notes, trying to represent some semblance of a melody. Interesting, isn't it? So the actual roots of the plain song has roots with the mathematicians of the early 10th century who used abacuses with Hindu and Arabic letters on them and moved them around. And you can see them, they're sitting with this in front of them, and the stave really in its original form is really a scientific graph, isn't it? It's part of the graph, what they would call the graph principle. So these elements in music of these quartet, the bow and the stave, the music, they seem to have pretty far-flung relationship, don't they? They seem to come from quite different places. Yet in our scene of the quartet, they're happily brought into coincidence, shall we say, with say, Vivaldi's, wonderful masterpiece. Interesting, isn't it? It's very interesting to me. A lot of the things that we do when we come to talk about music, particularly music in the church, there are things that underlie it that we don't really have much awareness of. There's a rich history of things that we deal with that we don't pay much attention to. There's a real narrative and social developments that have happened underneath it that we're not aware of. And I think it's just a really nice little thing for musicians, and I can feel this spirit in the room already, to come as one that doesn't have major preconceptions, to come with a heart that's quite open around this subject, to be amazed by it. As we take a quick look at the development of sacred music in Western society, it's quite a scattered tapestry of different things. And as we engage with it, I think you'll find that that's actually a really empowering, cool thing, and might speak to where we are today, and might offer some hints and some encouragement there. Music has this lovely way of being nomadic. It likes to travel. Music is a part of us. We carry our song and our culture with us, don't we? And that song goes into other places and we share it, and it takes on a form in those different places. I told you before that I played the Highland bagpipe, which is there in the middle, although that's a very ornamental looking bagpipe. It's not a real one. But in my studies of musicology, it's interesting to find that you can trace the origins of the bagpipe actually to Egypt, and it does this beautiful hikoi through Macedonia and all the way over to Ireland and to Scotland, and in each different country it takes on a different form. So you might see the Highland one's got three drones in the middle. Usually a longer one, a bass drone to the inner side and two tenors on the outside. The Irish bagpipe has only got two tenors on the top of it. The Macedonian bagpipe generally only has one single drone on it with the chanter, which makes the melody. And up the top left, you'll see the Ilian pipes, which are an Irish bagpipe. But their drones, they look downwards. And they're used with a bellow, and they are able to have more melodic scope because they can change key, where the other ones work on the principle, as does a lot of first world music that you find. It has a drone that kind of holds the music, and then a melody that comes on the top of it. And if in some cultures where they didn't have a drone, say like African cultures, it might be a percussive thing that's holding it together, like a drum beat. So with your djembes or whatever it is, and a melody over the top. You'll find this in Middle Eastern, daddle bookers and all sorts of drums. In Indian culture, tabla and stuff like that, with the singing over the top. So this kind of simple melody is quite a common language in early music, but particularly in Western music, drone and melody. And I think that's really interesting. As we start to talk about unpacking Pakeha song, can I just say that's a really funny title, wasn't it? Because Pakeha, if we read it, technically it just means not Māori, doesn't it? So I'm not going to go and unpack every world culture's music. No, but we all knew what that meant, And so I'm hoping that just by tracing a bit of a history from maybe our biblical texts through to Western civilization's rise in music, through to where we are today, you'll hear a lot of the narratives and the niggly bits and the great things that we have, the narratives that we have in our kind of worship music worlds today. Why isn't music flow better than it does? And why do bishops not like singers in the church? Or why aren't instruments allowed in the church? Why should there only be organ in the church? Actually, a lot of these conversations are centuries old. It's interesting when you think about the biblical text or music in the church. What are the kind of the biblical texts that might stick out in your mind? David, yeah, I think that's a great one. A lot of us would jump there. When I was thinking about it, the first ones that jumped to my head were, definitely the tabernacle, David's musicians in the tabernacle and the many psalms that are written, to the leader of this group, to be sung in this style. You'll see that written at the start of the Psalms. The other one that always sticks out to me, just because I was always fascinated with the book and the cultural context, was 1 Corinthians, where he's kind of telling the guys, you need to tone down on some of your practices here. It's getting a bit out of control. Why don't one of you bring a spiritual song? One of you bring a hymn. One speak in tongues. And you can kind of see that there's quite a few biblical verses that kind of talk about the literal use of music in worship.
Psalm where this psalm that has all of the different instruments.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And as someone that's done academic work, I want to try and be very clear with my language and not use the word orchestra or band, because they elicit very westernized things to our mind. So I'll try to be very careful with my language, but if I slip, just tolerate me. Because it's very easy for us to do that, isn't it? To look back with our modern eyes and see something that's not actually there. I don't want to go through all of these, but just to get a general flavour, I've only picked a handful of verses, believe it or not, and there's about 4 pages. But these are like literal, texts on the use of music in the Bible. So Genesis 4, we've got Jebel is described as the father of all who played stringed instruments and pipes. He's interestingly the son of Lamech. Does anyone know who Lamech is? Lamech's an interesting character. I don't know if, some scholars would disagree, but when Jesus talks about forgiven 7 times, 70 times, some make the argument that this is a callback to Lamech, because Lamech's one of these first people that sings this poem of, this young upstart tried to kill me in the village, and, I just straight up killed him. And why? Because I'm awesome and I'm Lamech, and no one's going to stand in front of me. And I didn't just give him 1 times the vengeance, I gave him 7 times, 70 times the vengeance. And so some people kind of draw back this line to him in that reference. The song Exodus, the song of Moses and the Israelites after crossing the Red Sea or the Reed Sea. Exodus, mentioning the noise of people singing. This is Joshua mistaking the sound of praise and worship after a battle as a sound of battle. 1 Samuel, David playing his lyre for King Solomon. That's an interesting one. Is he just playing music, or is he doing quite a liturgical thing? It's an interesting question. Chronicles, the Ark of the Covenant is brought to Jerusalem. Songs and instruments bringing it in. This is a very cultural thing. This is a ceremony happening. It's a liturgical movement. So you've got to see this as like being a worship service. Such an icon of who they are, of God's presence in their mind. They are dancing before their Lord. They're singing. They're praising. It's a thing. I suppose we don't have that cultural similarity, we can't, I suppose, unless we're talking about our rugby heroes. Yeah, in which case, we're fine to dance in front of the TV and, up that guy, and apart from the other Sunday, but we won't talk about that. I realise there's South Africans in the room. You might have been jumping around and praising. Yeah. Don't talk about the rugby in church. Yeah. We'll move on. The returning exiles had singers amongst them. This beautiful picture of Israel coming back together and the codifying of the sacred text starting to happen, but the minstrels there, it's like this big watershed moment for Israel after the Babylonian exile. And I see this scene in my head, and I'm like, oh man, that would have been just such a magical moment, Psalms obviously is proliferated with various excerpts of music. We jump into the New Testament, Corinthians, Acts, Ephesians, encouraging one to speak, one with a psalm, one with a hymn, one a song from the Spirit of the Lord. Colossians, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, and with gratitude in your heart, singing psalms. So there's just such a plethora of mentions of worship, music. But they're not always really explicit as to what they're doing, why they're doing it, how they're doing it. And so we can easily or quite shallowly take these texts and demand that they're a great, this is what worship is, and not really have done the hard mahi in behind it. Sitting in the back of these texts is the Jewish musical traditions. And what you'll notice from them is this definite use of chanting and recitation of texts. Psalms particularly, you'll see the use of instruments in their liturgical and ceremonial cultural events. Call and response and singing, and antiphonal thing. This is something that we do in classical Anglican church, isn't it? Antiphonal reading and singing, and it's something that you find right back there in the day, whether it's in a temple, whether it's around the family table. It's something that's part of their cultural thing. Temple worship was obviously a big thing when they had a temple. Oral culture, and I think this is interesting because this is what we were talking about before, which preceded which. Was it written down or was it not? And for those that don't know, the ancient Jews were an oral culture. A lot of them didn't write at all and couldn't read or write. Even in the time of Jesus, like the fishermen, probably put an X on something, and that was about the extent of their literacy. And as their society develops, you see that it's only really the high priests, the scribes, and royalty that have education or are able to get that kind of level of education. Of course, there's other forms of education, but that kind of level of literacy, it's not common. And so the scriptures were all transmitted orally. It's really interesting, isn't it? I think that's quite challenging for Western modern thinkers, because if we're not writing it down, we feel like they're probably not remembering it all, right? That's not necessarily the case. That's our lens, of course. If you're an oral culture, you've got very good ways of preserving a text. And so, the Hebrew language is a very creative, linguistic, it's got patterns and pictures and things. And, I remember Richard Raw even talking about literally the name of God, Yahweh, them talking about it just being the sound of breath. And they thought about the language and things like this, and everything that they did in life enhanced their theology, their worldview. Interesting, isn't it? Because we don't think about our breath being something of God. And we do maybe on Sundays for that 1 hour, but in our everyday, we don't treat our breath as sacred. But for them, they're breathing, they're literally saying the name of God. Interesting, isn't it? Fascinating. So music plays a big part in this oral culture thing, because if you think about your own education, how did you learn stuff when you were a kid? You sung songs about the alphabet, songs about the colours of the rainbow, didn't you? You sang little nursery rhymes that housed different moral, ethical teachings. And the same was done in their culture. They had lots of different ways to use their language and their recitation of things. Even numbers and acrostic patterns and stuff like that all came into play. Anything that they could use in the retention of the transmission of their traditions, scripture, they used. And it's beautiful. I think it's good to also say that music, can be a great teaching tool. Can be a great thing to kind of bring people into a real awareness of the simple things that we often don't take for granted. The thing that really stands out for me, and I think is really exciting, you see all the way throughout Jewish tradition, all the way throughout the early Christian church through to today, is the recitation of the Psalms, the use of that both as a spoken thing, a meditative thing, but as a musical thing too. It was developed over time, the Psalms, and by different authors. It depends on your scholarship here, but it was honed to become one body of work that took you through a prayer kind of a journey through the story of Israel. And one of the great things about it was that it, in its conception, acted as a literary temple. Isn't this interesting? So, why is that interesting? Great question. Thank you for asking that. The temple back in the day, if you think about going into it, it was a lot like a lot of our pre-Reformation churches. It was a very ornate building. It had, pictures, great pieces of art everywhere. It had pictures that told the story of the traditions. It had incense. It had priests in garbs doing rituals, humming prayers. It was a place that really took all of the senses, and drew them up into an awareness or a focus on God, much like I think a cathedral arch does. It has these long kind of sides that draw into a point, and they philosophically draw your eye up to something higher than yourself, your focus, And that was the kind of idea of the temple. But of course, when the temple got destroyed, temple worship, it's not really an option, is it? And so the Psalter, or the Psalms, really was this virtual literary temple where people could come to these texts and see these stories and recite these prayers of their history, of the patriarchs, and it really gave them language also to pray, which we desperately need, I think. I don't know that we're a church, wide that's great with prayer, and maybe the tradition of reading through the Psalms and praying through the Psalms is something that we do need to come back to, because it really does give us the language of prayer, the language of lament, doesn't it? Of petition, of adoration, and they're things that even when I say those things, you might think, I don't know if I naturally hit all those things in my prayer life. I'm definitely good at petition, definitely good at asking for things. Am I good at lamenting things? Am I good at using that language and putting our prayer before God in a measured way? I think the other thing that people get a little bit excited about there is that the Psalms really do give pride of place to emotion. And for people that don't like emotion, that sends them running to the door. But I think what the Psalms also do is they caution us not to let emotions overcome us. So they instead give us language and a form in which to use these feelings, these emotions, through beautiful language. And they give us figures too to show us how this works, and David is one of these figures. So the recitation of the Psalms and putting it to music has been such a staple of the church in every different country all throughout Europe. I would argue that throughout all of the different styles, and rises and falls of culture, the Psalms has been the one thing that's been a staple in every church, in every denomination, in every country. Whether that's the Genevan Psalter, and you, who's that guy that did the Institutes, John Calvin, whether that's the Anglican Church, whether that's the Scottish Psalter, it's something that's quite common to us all. Interesting, isn't it? I am a music geek. It's coming out. I want to be practical for you, so I'll zoom through a few of these things, but some of it's really interesting. So monasticism plays a really big part in the development of church music in the ancient periods. So we're talking pre-500 AD here. We find the biggest contribution in the form of Gregorian chant or plain chant. And so, as we talked about before, plain chant in its earliest form was very simple, hence the term, and it usually just figured one voice. In the very early stages of it, it was very monotonal, da 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 da, and then it might have some variation, da 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 da. It's something about the simplicity of it was beautiful. And I was listening to a church historian just recently from Oxford talking about how the beauty of that form of plain chant really attributed to the growth of Christianity. And Interestingly, people that would come in and be sick because, they didn't have social welfare and hospitals like we did today, they would come and listen to these things, and they would have miraculous moments listening to this plane. Like legs would snap into place, and it was amazing because I've never thought of plain chant as being a place where something like that would happen. It challenges some of our bias. So we think like, oh, that's not the place with that kind of thing, is it? Surely that's made up. Surely. It grew over the centuries into having polyphony. So polyphony is a musical term that means two melodies. So that would lead into what we were talking about before. One voice might be a drone, while the other one goes and they meet together into the development of two equal melodies that start implying chordal textures. The other thing that's really interesting about this is the taking on of the Western meantime tune system, which is attributed to Pythagoras. Did anyone know that? Yeah. So in lots of different parts of the world, their octave, they have many more notes than 12 in between it. But we've got these 12 tones. So, in our Western music, these 12 tones are... That's your tone. In a lot of Eastern music, you'll have tones that are in between this increment. And when you hear it as someone that's formed in the Western world, you'll hear them hit the notes and you'll be like, ooh, was that meant to happen? And yes, it was. Contrafactum. Oh, this is so interesting. Oh no, we're not there yet. Contrafactum is a term that means the taking of a musical melody and putting different lyrics to it. A lot of stuff happened in this early century, A lot of stuff that we use today. A lot of hymnists picked this idea up, didn't they, with metric hymns? Oh, we can sing this psalm but put it to this different melody, right? It finds its roots in this period. Notated music was also a thing, like I talked about before, the plain chant. And you could say that was somewhat a throwback from the Jewish tradition of needing to pass on and codify, what was the sacred melodies in that, which I think is really interesting too. I think it's good to note, though, as we finished talking about that period, is that monastic music and what they did, and they did some extraordinary things. That wasn't a snapshot of what the church looked like at that time as a whole. There was no homogeneous style or practice, or no one culture, dictated what church music looked like at that scene. And I think if you cast your mind back to 1 Corinthians and you think about the melting pot that Corinth would have been with all of the different temple cults at the time, it goes without question, really, that the singers of one temple would have heard the singers from a different temple. You would have heard the musics of different cultures and things as you walk down the marketplace. You would have been inspired by them. You would have had conversations about them. You as a musician, would have actually played music with some of these people to make money on the streets. So I think you can make the argument that church music was just as varied in some of these early centuries as there were different groups claiming the name of Christianity, of being Christians. I found this really great quote from Origen. Many of you know who early church father Origen. He makes this big deal out of a polemic onslaught that was taken from a philosopher called Celsius, and Celsius wrote this. One of the charges that he makes against the Christian gatherings was of the use of the drum and the reed pipe, the alios. Drums in the early church, really? Right there, in Origen's writing. Thank you very much. Drums right there, which was played before worship, just as the priests of Cybele did. He says that they did this in order to induce a state of orgiastic frenzy, and that they did that to numb the intellect of the people. He was a pagan rationalist, and his thought was that nobody in their right mind could accept the claims that Christianity meant about the resurrection of Jesus. So it must have been necessary to rob them of their intellect with such kind of music before their services. Interesting, eh? bit of a grain of salt. His work only remains in Origen's, Tract 8 against him, so we might think, maybe he didn't say all of that stuff. But it's interesting. I think it points to the fact that there are different musical styles being had in different places, yeah? Move on to medieval music. Polyphony starts to become an even bigger thing. So very extravagant music starts being written for moets, cantatas, different parts of the service, liturgical service, like the Glorias and all these things. Many different authors are now starting to write different melodic passages for it. It starts becoming a big thing. The polyphony of the melodies start to take on a whole new elements where they're like fixed. Sometimes they're fixed in intervals like fourths or fifths, which if you're a classical music or anyone's ever been trained is a big no-no. But back in those days, that was the thing. And interestingly, the rock musicians of the 60s and the 70s picked that interval up because it's got such a chunky dun, dun, dun. We know them as power chords, those intervals. Anything that had a flat third in it was literally from the devil. Interesting. We'll get there. We start to notice the tension of some bishops being cautious about the roles of singers in music and worship music. Ooh, bishops. Yeah.
Were women singing in that?
Interesting. I think you could make the argument that in some of the monastic practices, definitely, like Catherine of Siena and what's that other lovely lady's name? Oh, she's in this window over here, isn't it? Cecilia. Yeah. They're definitely starting to sing and compose. I wouldn't be able to give you a date and drill down. I think that's a very nuanced discussion, but yeah, I would want to argue yes. Definitely, and some of them were pioneers, Love that she's up there. It's very cool. The rise of secular music starts hitting the world, and you've got troubadours and minstrels all over the place. Gregorian chants now starting to disseminate into different churches around the world as the Roman Rite is starting to be proliferated throughout different churches. Charlemagne, I don't know if you know much about Western history, but Charlemagne, the emperor, he's one of these guys that's wanting to start bringing the empire into control and conformity, and part of that was led with the church. And so him and, who was the Pope? Pope Adrian I were really the people that started wanting to bring order or uniformity, not necessarily in a bad way, I don't think. It'd be bad to think about that suspiciously, although, maybe a little bit. They're wanting, to unify the church, I think, if we look at it in a nice way. The earliest forms of the organ start coming in to play in this century in a big way. The organ actually comes in much earlier in the church, or into society, even somewhere like 300-400 BC. But you'll find that the earliest versions of the organ are of something called the hydraulis. Has anyone ever looked at this or studied this? No? Interesting. It was a water-powered instrument, and so it literally had a pump. And so someone would be playing it, and someone would be pumping the water in order to make the sound out of the pipes. And I wonder if that's where the term "pump it up" comes from. I don't know. Just a little joke there, Interesting, yeah. Yeah, you can hear that. Try it. Yeah. Can we get our organist to wear that on Sunday? Might all need to go to the bathroom. But it starts becoming a prominent part in worship. And it does so, obviously, because it's a beautiful instrument. It has a lot of range, but it grew over many centuries. And it really did fill the space of the big cathedrals and that were getting built. And its big, ornamental things just really matched the architecture of the buildings and really backed choirs and choral songs so well. The Renaissance period, it's starting to really blow up now, this real rich sense of polyphony and really complex melody in church music, like very ornate. It's complex. It's beautiful, and it's the kind of thing where people would come in and they would listen, and you'll hear people talk about letting it wash over them and things like that, because engaging in it maybe, intellectually wasn't that possible. It was more of an experiential, cultural, come in and experience it, and you can see some of the early roots of evensong and that kind of popping up through some of these compositions. Rise of instrumental music and opera. This was interesting, and this started causing a lot of friction because, the rise of humanism was really coming up at the end of this period, and it was really starting to overvalue the worth of humans and how great we were. And it leads us into this period of the Reformation. Does anyone know who that is? Oh, very good. Very quick. Gold star. And this is an interesting period. There's starting to be an influx of the printing press and things like that. So people are starting to get their hands on Bibles. Well, not full Bibles, but different instructions, pamphlets of different texts, and so on. Hymns are starting to be printed and become a thing. Luther, this German monk and priest from the Catholic Church, was quite upset with the indulgent practice of the time. You know this history, eh? So the indulgent practice was you could pay to have your sins forgiven, to have one of your family's sins forgiven, or time off out of purgatory was some of the narratives around this. You could even pay for your ancestors to, Anyway, and he didn't like this because, the big guys up the top were getting big wallets and the poor were getting preyed upon, and, it was a horrible thing. So he wrote these 95 Theses to reform some of these practices in the church because he wanted to see change to the church he loved. I think it's a point we often miss with Luther. But he obviously touched a nerve and something that was happening at the time, and it became a big watershed for the church, didn't it? And caused a whole, what we call a schism. It's a great word to use, isn't it? Schism. Yeah, so what is interesting about this part? In terms of music, what I think is really good to learn here is that different traditions started doing different things. There was a lot of polemic assault put on the Roman Catholic Church. Their use of very ornate, dress, music, opera, art in the church, it was seen as items that may be become items of worship in themselves, other than looking at the main thing, shall we say? I'm representing someone else's theology. Yes, yeah. But that's the general argument. So the Calvinist tradition, John Calvin, a leading figure in the Reformation or of the Reformed tradition, he had a very reserved approach to music in the church. He was interesting. He wanted to re-promote, should I say, simplicity in the church and not fanciful elaborations of worship, because it was about the Word of God, and anything that kind of detracted from that was to be cut. He's very that side of the things. Not my cup of tea, but I loved how staunch he is. I love a man of conviction. He saw the congregational participation as important, and I think this is an interesting thing. He thought that it was best in the form of simple hymns without musical accompaniment or harmony. And, that church for many years used the Genevan Psalter of 1562, a set of metrical psalms translated in French and tweaked by Louis Borges, that was then translated into German and Dutch, and for the longest time was the only tune book of the Reformed churches of continental Europe. Interesting, this one book for many years. Some of us grumble about playing the same songs, at church for a couple of weeks in a row. Anyway, on the more extreme end, you've definitely got the Anabaptist and the Puritan traditions, the more radical reformers, the role of music and art for them, definitely it was becoming a source of worship in themselves, and they needed to cut that stuff out. And so, if there was congregational singing in their church, it was voice only, but that seems to be very rare. The Roman Catholic Church, well, in response to a lot of the debates that were going around at the time, they had their Council of Trent, in the 1500s. And their response to this was to address the concerns about the use of music in worship. The council reaffirms the value of sacred music and aims to clarify and regulate its use, emphasizing that the text should be clearly understood and the music should not overshadow the words. Interesting narrative, eh? I feel like that bit of dialogue right there is something that's still very prolific in our conversations. It was a pivotal moment for them in affirming the importance of sacred music, while retaining their perceived excesses. The Lutheran tradition. Now, this guy is really interesting. He's got a lot going on. Martin Luther, a key figure, obviously, in the Protestant Reformation, valued music greatly, and he encouraged and maybe can be seen somewhat as a father of congregational singing. He translated the Psalms into hymns, into German. Sorry, he translated those all into hymns. Composed hymns himself. Did I just say gyms? That's great. He went to the gym. He was a great guy. I've heard of this guy, Jim. I just haven't met him. That was a joke. You're allowed to laugh. One of his famous songs, and I don't know this one, but a lot of people seem to know it, is "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Yeah. So that was him. He believed that music was a means to express the faith, and that congregational participation in singing was crucial for the edification of believers. I think he's got some really salient points here, because one of the things that we struggle with in our congregations is not to have is to have an active church, to engage them actively. Because otherwise, if they're passive and they're sitting there, you start to wonder, why are we doing this? It's a form for, or liturgy is the work of the people, is the saying that we go on and on about. And if we're not all doing it and we're not all participating, it can feel like a non-event, can't it? And I think Luther is kind of capturing something here, and he's saying song has this real ability to transcend normal boundaries in confessing things for ourselves and presenting different narratives to our mind, which we really need to do. Otherwise, the narratives of this world crush us, don't they? The publication of hymnals, obviously with the printing press, boomed. The English hymn book was in place during the English Reformation for like many years, and they used old metric hymns, usually called by the old version, the 1562. It's funny, we haven't gotten away from some of these names of our hymns, don't we? And then someone produced a book, Nathan Tate, that is, and Nicholas Brandy, in 1962, called the New Version. We're so creative, Anglicans, eh? We got the old version, we got the new version. 62, George Withers creates hymns and songs of the church, and this was really probably the first attempt at a really comprehensive hymn book in the English church. But it had little success, and I wonder personally if it's because of that. What are we doing? There's different expressions, am I going to get into trouble? Is it in my language? There's all these different things. That's another really interesting thing, like with the Reformation, the translation of the Bible into the vernacular is a huge thing. And using the vernacular of a country, of your national language, is just so important. And I think that's something that resonates for definitely us, the use of Te Reo Māori, and particularly with social justice and all sorts of our history, bleeding into our, today and the problems we face. A lot of us in the church of my generation feel a real sacred pull towards the use of Te Reo in our music. Being something that in its endeavour to use is a step of reconciliation, of love and respect. I love its linguistic nature. I think it's very sing-songy, and it's got a lot of character to it, eh? Hey, bro. It's got a lot of character, and it's our unique voice, you know, and I think that's a really important thing. Great Awakening revival movements, Negro spiritual music, you know, coming into the 19th century. You've got all sorts of jazz and stuff coming out of church music. The Gregorian chant stuff, it comes back in style again, and jazz musicians are like, hey, if you take this 7-note scale and you start it on that note and you make that the new scale, we have these 7 different modes, and we can create this really like edgy kind of sound and put drums to it, you know, and it becomes like this whole really amazing moment in music. Not that early composers weren't doing modal stuff, but you know, jazz that came through Negro spirituals was definitely a really cool thing. Revival moments like the third wave, what we often refer to as the third wave of charismatic renewal, touched our shores. It's good to talk about what happened to us, in the 60s and the 70s. And you'll notice that people like the St. Paul's... Has anyone heard that album or went to the St. Paul Singers back in the day?
We used to use their music in Hamilton.
Did you? Wow. So, and I think this is challenging when you read it too, because you think, oh, would those things kind of go together? So this very high Anglican expression of churchmanship, you know, encountered, you know, the Spirit, so to speak, and they had these very holy. I suppose you can only just call it just very experiential, charismatic, spirit-filled things, but that, you know, in a very traditional Anglican setting, and you know, one minute they'd be singing all of these hymns and very traditional things, processing the cross, and the next minute they'll be all on the floor, slain in the Spirit, and you think, oh, this is so interesting, isn't it? I notice a lot of young people are being drawn towards liturgy and Anglican movements. They're just not necessarily joining Anglican churches, and so that's a question we need to solve. Yeah, that's right. What can we learn from all of that? And you know, maybe in looking at some of that, you might have noticed what are some of the narratives that are present as challenges in your communities, that are narratives that maybe hark back to some of the things that we've just talked about. But what can we maybe learn from that? I'd love to just suggest, because I've been the one that's had to sit with it the longest and think about it, that singing really is a powerful thing, isn't it? It's a thing that we share together. Singing really does engage our congregations. It's a wonderful tool for learning, but don't always use it like that, because it's more than that. It's very unfortunate that there is that narrative that people don't often remember the sermon, but they remember the songs. But knowing that is really empowering. Singing has a way to create an atmosphere too, doesn't it? Much like hospitality does, like warm lights and a set table, music has that same way to bring ease and calm and welcome to people. And just knowing some of these things and being, you know, quite active around that can make such a difference to our churches and their feeling and their vibe. If you'll excuse that language, because that's the kind of thing that you've got to think about, the atmosphere. It's not just the form of thing, it's how does it feel? What kind of a space are we creating for people to enter into? And that stuff's important, It's part of hospitality. That's part of Manaaki Tanga, Just maybe from the floor, what are some interesting things that you pulled out of that, or anything that was interesting to you, really, out of all of that? Your turn to talk.
Well, one that I think is quite very much is this tension between the word and the music, and the words still being there. That's why I've got some of those things, because I think increasingly, to me, most people sit like right up very forward today, and the words pretty kind of almost banal, not all, but many.
Interesting.
Whereas when I look back at the hymns, I find many of them, the message to me is stronger than
Interesting. Hmm.
But that probably says something about our generation, because the language has changed too. You know, what's meaningful to us, people are going to think about
Hmm.
not being too possessive of what where we're at and what means
Mm.
needs. It's a real challenge.
It is, eh?
But I do find a lot of modern music is just repetitive, and it's just doesn't have enough sort of meat to it.
Mm.
Some
Mm.
of the old music's fantastic, too.
Yes, you can make these arguments on both sides of the fence, can't you? But it's an interesting conversation. It's a good conversation.
I'm sure you actually don't want the conversation about it. You want us to respond to what you've been saying. But for me,
I'm happy to receive.
the connection between contemplative prayer, in which we often use a mantra, something very, very simple, and the more charismatic tendency to have repetitive words.
Mm.
They're doing the same thing.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was doing it individually, the others doing it for the congregation,
Mm.
where you're seeking to enter into a place spiritually together through something repetitive and simple, rather than theology and music, which is more of a
That's a very good point. Mm.
I think some of the contemporary, certainly in Māoridom, is if you take the word atua or whāia, right, you actually get quite a big response on marae and setting some back, because even though the imperatives are there, you know, love, peace, faith, hope, all of those things are still there in the waiata, but God, the word itself, is not being used. They willingly and with gusto will sing that sort of thing, but it's not the tradition of the church.
Yeah.
It's an interesting case.
Yeah, interesting. Any other thoughts?
Just also love that some of the things that you traced around the way different tones are used, even a bit about, so I've spent some time with Muslim people, and they've done that thing of a whole lot more notes being in there and it kind of being jarring for me, but being beautiful to my Muslim friends.
Mm. Yeah.
I just love playing chords on the piano and feeling what happens when you move that chord up to a different key. It's a different feel, and I love that.
Mm. My friend Richard loves key changes. He's the king of key changes. I've got an interesting quote here for you. This was, you tell me when you think this quote was from. There are several reasons for opposing modern music. 1, it's too new. 2, it's often worldly, even blasphemous. The new Christian music is not as pleasant as the more established styles. Because there are so many songs, you can't learn them all. It puts too much emphasis on instrumental music rather than godly lyrics. The new music creates disturbances, making people act indecently and disorderly. The preceding generation got along without them. It's a money-making scheme, and some of these new music upstarts are lewd and loose. Anyone want to take a guess of when this quote might be from? This was written in the 1700s, 1723 in fact, attacking Isaac Watts, the writer of great hymns like When I Survey the Wondrous Cross and Joy to the World. Lewd and loose. I know. How polemic is that? In Anglican language, oh, you're out. You can wrap up the session?
So did you tell us who wrote it?
It was a pastor of a church in England
Critiquing.
in 17. Yeah, so yeah, you could have thought that it was about Hillsong, couldn't you? But it was about Isaac Watts.
It's just such a reminder that the tensions are of every generation, and which, in my understanding, is about change, really, because we grow up with a familiar sound in our ear, and for some people that's the organ, for someone else it's an a cappella singing group, for someone else it's the sound of the guitar, for someone else it's chanting, and it becomes our memory is a muscle in that respect. It's memory making for us, and we have these experiences that form our sense of faith and of the church, and it's very hard to let go of them, and it's very hard to start accessing God or experiencing God or being aware of God in any other way. And it's a muscle that we've got to keep working at in the church, because we're in this very, very difficult place with such rapid decline. And I think that looking at this history that we've heard about, the diversity of music in the church is something we should celebrate, and not be homogenous about what we do, but try different things, I think is what I'm hearing of. Try different things, see what resonates with people, because it teaches people to be flexible and to make space for others. You'll always have niche churches. You'll always have destination churches that's their niche, that's their style and their flavour. We have in the central city, we've got St Matthew in the city and St Paul's Simon Street, two wonderful churches with a distinct style, right, musically, a distinct niche style that they do incredibly well. And I think we'll always have those churches that have that element to them. But I think for a lot of us, it's trying to grow things and get people in and get some energy going, offering diversity of music will be a strength for us. Utilising the old hymns, having someone play on the organ where that's possible, although our organists are slowly disappearing before our eyes, but having that opportunity, having something on guitar, having something chanted, listening to some instrumental music, I think broadening our what we're accessing, it will be a helpful thing. I was going to talk, and I'm going to talk more about choosing music, but I'm also aware of the time, and I don't want to put our catering team out, but let me make a start, and then maybe I'll do a little bit more when we come back, okay? So I wanted to do a little pivot now into a little bit more practical stuff around how we're choosing music in our services. So choosing music, theme, I put theme and music, but I want that second word to be theme and mood. Scratch music out of your mind, theme and mood. Something I notice in Anglican settings is a real emphasis in choosing music based on theme. It's very strong in what we do. It's a wonderful way of enhancing the idea or the atmosphere or the teaching of the day. So whether or not that's, we're reading Psalm 23, we're going to sing Psalm 23 and we're going to preach on Psalm 23. It's a way of enhancing whatever the idea you're trying to express to the group of people that day. I do think, though, sometimes we can overwhelm people with the themes in our services and sort of bombard them almost at every point in the service. And I think it'd be useful to think a little bit about, when we're choosing music, to think about theme and mood. Nicola and I were talking a little bit about this before in the break, and I think that we can afford to think more in the concept of mood, which may move us away from lyrical content being right on point with your theme, but more about what is that. Dan used the word atmosphere, which is so good for music. What is the music? How is the music contributing to the atmosphere of worship? How will people feel when they enter into the space? How will they feel as they move towards communion? How will they feel as they pray? Even how will they feel as they have a cup of tea together? Music can play such a big part of the mood of the space. So utilising theme and mood when we're choosing music becomes really important. Definitely wouldn't do away with the idea of theme, selecting songs and hymns based on what your preacher's talking about, maybe on the readings of the day. Such a great way of enhancing the idea, particularly with that point that keeps coming through, that people are getting their theology from the songs and not the sermons. Then by choosing thematically, hopefully you're still enhancing those points. But I just would encourage people to think a little bit more about mood and also about theme. Singing and instrumental was the second thing I wanted to talk about. So this is, utilising music that isn't just about congregational singing, utilising instrumental music. You might have heard, or you might not have, it might not have been loud enough, but when you came here we had instrumental music playing, and during the break, Dan and I utilised a lot of instrumental music in the service. One reason, if you don't have a musician, instrumental music is a very, very good companion to a group or to a ministry unit. We choose a lot of music that is like scores from movies, not too well known, like don't James Bond it or something like that, but like, you know, like sort of swelling orchestral music from movies that I'll hear and I'll go, oh, that would be wonderful as like a sort of a moment of reflection after the sermon or something like that. And so we utilise a lot of that, and particularly at services where we don't have a musician at them, that's a way to create that mood, but you don't have a live music team, and that's okay, you can still do that. So we've introduced here an extra song in our format for the service, which is a post-sermon sort of response song, for lack of a better term. And it's a chance for people to, after the sermon, to just take a pause, think about what has resonated for them in that moment, what has God been saying to them, and then have a song there where we can either sing together congregationally, and we'd probably choose really strong on theme at that point, or an instrumental piece of music, and just lead people with perhaps one sort of evocative question coming out of that sermon time to let them sit and meditate. And that's a really good way that we find using instrumental music really useful. We also are playing instrumental music during communion if we don't have a live musician in the service that day as well. And so we've got lots and lots of playlists on Spotify with different moods to different lengths of time that we can play through Bluetooth. So hopefully if you don't have music, does everyone have access to Bluetooth or to be able to play some recorded music? Because that's we're finding that invaluable here, and that's what we use primarily at our Good Friday service. I think maybe between Richard and us, we'd had maybe 2 live songs that we sang together, but everything else was scripture reading, the story from the garden through to the crucifixion, and then instrumental music to evoke mood and response in people, and we found that really useful.
We used environmental sounds, didn't we?
Yeah, at Easter we used environmental sounds. So for the garden scene, we had crickets, sounds of crickets, and we had wind. Sorry? Yeah, there you go. For Pentecost, yes, we had wind sound, didn't we, for Pentecost as well. And you can find all of that stuff on Spotify, and you can put it together in a playlist, and and just have it there ready to play, and it creates so much atmosphere for what you're doing in a service. And we'd be happy to share with you some of the artists that are sort of our go-tos for instrumental music. Max Richer is one that we use a lot of. He did a very beautiful reworking of Vivaldi's Four Seasons, but does a lot of really lovely orchestral stuff, very long pieces of music, 15 or 20 minutes long. So maybe not, you don't want to play the whole thing in your service. It would take up.
He's a minimalist too, right?
Yeah. So
But you could always fade it out.
you can fade it out. This is the beauty of technology. You can fade it in and out just for whatever you want to use it for. Dustin O'Halloran is another one that we use quite a lot of. And then a lot of score music. If you're sitting watching a movie and you hear something stunningly beautiful, take a note of who the composer was, because you might be able to use it.
Just the piano.
Yes.
It's lovely.
Yeah.
Quiet music, especially during communion.
Yes, yeah. This is all the sort of stuff that we were playing when people came in. So this is this, and we have playlists that we're using before a service, things during, and then things after the service as well. But this sort of thing is what Richard's referring to. Another 12:25. The other thing around utilising non-singing, non-congregational music is using more familiar tunes to people. So you can also use some of the biggest classical pieces, I think, that people will recognise, the flower duet, things like that. I think all of those things, sometimes we're hesitant about bringing what might be considered as secular music into the church, and yet I think that that's a really great inroad for people in the church and new people in our context to connect in. I referenced classical music then, but we played a bit of the Beatles through Advent last year. I did last year and the year before. That's a great connective way for new people coming into the church, or all of us, to enjoy a bit of the Beatles inside the church. We're not necessarily saying that we agree with all the theology of the song. It's not, but we're utilising a moment to connect people into a greater idea that we're trying to share with people. So I think it's another good thing to not be too afraid of, because I think that you can always give commentary as to why you're utilising something. You can always do that with people. We also occasionally, when we haven't had musicians, occasionally we'll use canned music as backing tracks. Do some people use them? Does you use them occasionally at St. Paul's? Where you play a track and people sing along to a track? Yeah? So we do this from time to time, and I've listened to some particular albums that are specifically for, congregations to begin singing to. And we actually ended up choosing, instead of those sorts of artists, we chose an album which was on Spotify, which was like the best hymns ever. And it's choirs singing. So the voices are already in it. And we found that it actually was a greater access point for people to start the singing. It can be quite hard to start singing in those tracks, unless you've got someone who kind of goes, oh, now we're going, or singing into the microphone and gets everybody into it. But if you lose your way, it can be quite difficult to find your way back to where you're going. So we decided to use recordings of big choirs singing songs that were really full and organ, and we're offering people something that's really important in our context here, which is the sound of the organ. It's a real comfort for people here, and we don't want to do away with that for people. So offering them that experience. I'm just trying to find the album that we used, and I can play one for you that we used quite a few times. Let me give it some volume though. Okay. So this is the St. Michael's Singers singing Love Divine. Now the other cool thing about playing this and having people sing to it is they feel like they're a fantastic group of singers. It boosts people. They're like, what? We were incredible this morning. And so choosing tracks that already have voices can be quite a good way to encourage people and not feel so embarrassed of everybody can hear me. I did put on once and mistakenly didn't assess that there was a huge instrumental at about the 2-minute mark. And then in great, wonderful hymns, the final verse went into some, what is it when the final verse, they go into a different melody or something? And it just changed and it got fuller and fuller and we didn't really know what we were doing. But it was a great moment and it felt powerful. But that's another way, if you don't have musicians in your context, or you don't have them regularly, is to mix it up by using different music from Spotify. And we can share all these playlists or particular groups that we've found quite useful. Let me finish there so we can get some food into us, and then we'll come back and I want to spend a bit more time talking about accessibility and how we're choosing music and how we're making space for people in our services. So why don't we do that after the break? So does that sound all right? Okay. Let me say a prayer of thanks and some blessing for our food, and then we'll head into the St. Jude's room.